I'd like to welcome you to a special edition of New Frontiers. Now, today we're going to spend some time sizing up the presidential race. We're going to talk about how both Kamala Harris as well as Donald Trump, regardless of what you see in polling, can still win. Who are independents and what role do they play in deciding the winner? Maybe help you think about why you might want to register as an independent. Now, as for me, I'm just a typical optimistic American who still believes that the U.S. is a great cause for good. We always appreciate your comments, and I read every single one. If you're interested in this message, let's hit that subscribe button and let's get going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right, so let me start with this. The candidate who is able to attract the majority of independents will win this race in November. Now, that is counter to the logic that most consultants are looking at the race from. What they believe is that all a candidate needs to do is a better job of turning out their base. This is definitely the approach that both candidates seem to be taking. Well, I can guarantee you this. This election will be one of the highest turnout elections in American history. Both sides are motivated. Both candidates have a real base of support in their prospective party. But those people who will make this decision are motivated mainly by what they fear in the candidate they dislike more than what they like about their prospective candidate. This race is going to be decided by less than 400,000 people spread over 7 swing states. The winner of the 2024 presidential election will be determined not by the popular vote. It will be determined by who wins 270 delegates in the Electoral College. Now, I would point out to those who are interested to go to a really great website. It's called 270towin.com. It's an interactive tool that helps you understand the Electoral College. Now, I'm going to put up this first slide, and what it's going to show you is that today there are really 7 swing states. You see all of them here in gray. Now, 10 years ago, the swing states included places like Florida and Ohio, as well as Virginia. I think it's fair to remove those as the potential pickups for Republican candidates will end up including both Florida and Ohio, and the Democrats are pretty much for sure going to win Virginia. The states that matter are Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and most importantly, 19 electoral votes or delegate votes, Pennsylvania. You can see that with these gray states that the electoral votes they're simply not enough for either the Democrat or the Republican to get to the 270. Neither, with this particular map, would have the necessary votes to win. Now watch these numbers if you just count the states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. This for Democrats is what's known as the blue wall. If they win all those states, the Democrats win by going to about 279 delegates. However, you need every one of those states to win. There are 2 big states in question behind the blue wall from a polling standpoint for the Democrats, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin is much more of a rural state, and so it's more at risk for Democrats. However, Pennsylvania has urban areas of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but yet it has a big rural area in between. Yet Pennsylvania polling goes back and forth for either candidate. And when they do that polling, what they have to do is they have to create a prediction model for which of the 2 bases, Democrats or Republicans, will turn out at a higher level. Now, if the Democrats lose only Wisconsin, the state that is in play, then they have to pick up either Arizona or Georgia to get to the needed 270 delegates. But if they lose Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, they can't win it with both Arizona and Georgia unless they get Nevada. And as you can see from this map, they lose any of those 3, the Republican wins. Now, what you can see here is that Joe Biden won all of those 7 states. And it's what rightfully should be considered a landslide election because Biden had he had 306 delegates. However, it's a good guess that 100,000 voters in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin could have resulted in a win for Trump in the 2020 election. What we know from polling today is that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are in a much tighter contest in those states than Biden and Trump in 2020. At this point, as of August 15th, most experts are saying that Donald Trump has the advantage. Now, look at the polling and the map. I don't see it that way, but I definitely think Trump can still win, as you will see in a moment. If you haven't figured out yet, I use the term independent and unaffiliated voters interchangeably. There are large numbers of voters in these 7 swing states that are what I call independents or unaffiliated. In most of these states, it's almost 1/3 of all the votes. In Arizona, as an example, it is literally 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican, and 1/3 independent or unaffiliated voters. However, some portion of those independent voters actually lean towards the Democrat or Republican Party. What you see here is a Pew poll in 2024 that shows the actual amount of independent voters in each of the swing states that are actually independent. You can see that the actual vote of 15 to 21% of the total voters in that state are actually independent. Now, here's what that means. What that means is that these voters are not only undecided, but on issues they're not clearly a Democrat or Republican. We know from polling that 90 to 95% of Democratic voters are going to vote for Kamala Harris, and that 85, a little less for Donald Trump, but 85 to 95% of the Republicans will vote for Donald Trump. Now, Trump is at a disadvantage here because there are more Republicans who might vote against him than Democrats who might vote against Kamala. His converting a higher percentage of Republicans matters, but not as much as turnout. They are both focused on this turnout issues. But the real key, whether they focus on it or not, as you can see, are independent voters. And as you can see, in each state, if a candidate wins an overwhelming number of those independents that are truly independents, they're going to win the majority of those 7 states, and that means they're going to win the presidency. Now, I have done and seen significant amounts of polling of independent voters across the country. From my view, here on the ground in Arizona, both candidates are doing a great job with their base voters. However, both of them are doing a fairly poor job trying to attract independents. The grassroots campaign is non-existent for independents, and the messaging campaign of both candidates are lackluster for people who are unaffiliated with the 2 major parties. So let's spend a moment talking about just who are these real independent voters. Now, as I told you, some portion of the total amount of independent voters lean towards the Republican Party and some towards the Democratic Party. Some are very conservative and some are very liberal. But a large portion of these voters, over half, are truly independent voters. And as you'll see from Pew, almost 50% of independents are actually independent. Campaigns have struggled to understand these voters, but you need to start with paring out those who actually have partisan instincts. Of those that are remaining, there are actually traits that we found, again in polls, that are unique to this group of voters. It's just not the same way that you would measure a partisan voter. First, they prioritize issues differently than party voters. Second, they want to be seen as an individual and not part of a group. And third, this is really important, they're worried about the extremes in both political parties. They're offended by candidates who sell out to their extremes. Now, let's start with the first one, that they prioritize issues differently. What does this actually mean? So, as an example, if you're pro-life and that's your top issue, then there's a very good odds-on favorite that you're a Republican. If you are pro-choice and that is your top priority issue, well, there's a good chance you're a Democrat. Now, if you're pro-choice or pro-life, doesn't matter which one, but the economy or national security or free elections are your higher priority, than being pro-choice or pro-life, your odds go up that you may be an independent voter. Independents simply do not prioritize the issues the same way that people do inside the two parties. And that's partly why the partisan vision of the economy is based on who's in power. As you can see in this particular slide, when Trump was in power, the Republicans thought the economy was great. Democrats thought that it was terrible. The reverse happened when Biden became president. It didn't really have anything to do with the economy. It had to do with reasons other than the economy, in that they were loyal to their tribe, and the economy just simply wasn't their priority issues. The cultural war issues were their priority. That is definitely not true for real independents. Now, the second issue. These voters may be conservative or liberal, and then there's this true independent base that I talked about. But one thing that unifies all of them is they don't want to be identified as part of a group. They see themselves as individuals, and they're generally more tolerant of seeing other people as individuals. They don't see people as being part of a group. Now, as for me, again, there are lots of different ways that independents look at issues, but I place at the top of my belief system the importance of the individual. I believe the single greatest thing that has led to the advancement of mankind is the individual. It has been the empowerment by government, the individual over itself, that is the greatest thing that our government ever did. Now, this was done through the Constitution that eventually led to civil rights, equal rights, human rights, free elections, free enterprise, property rights, and free markets. All of those things, while they evolved, came from our Constitution, and every one of them were designed around the individual. I believe there is a value to preserving the American world order, because that order not only follows the rule of law, but it tries to empower more individuals who will create more products. You know, most of the big problems that we have in our society, they're going to be fixed by the private sector, not by government. Imagine the problems that will be solved with the driverless car. And who do you think is going to create them? Who will create the cure to cancer or extend human life? Government? Or will it be individuals, the private sector? And these voters, these independent, they are dramatically more concerned about a federal deficit that seems out of control. They're driven, again, by real economic issues, and they believe that the size of government has a negative effect on economic growth. Last, these independent voters, they actually like who we are. They like America, and they believe that while we're not perfect, we are a great cause for good. And where parties think that you either have to be pro-business or pro-labor, or you have to be pro-business or pro-education, or you're pro-God or you're pro-human rights. Independents believe that literally every issue doesn't have to be binary. I mean, think about this. How can you be pro-labor without being pro-business? How can you be pro-business without being pro-education? And you're saying that God doesn't support human rights? Independents don't believe in those binary positions, but political parties try to force you into them. True independent voters are concerned about the extremes in both parties. And this is true for what they see as being the far right and the far left. Now, as an example, on the far right, it's not lost on anyone that the riot that broke into the Capitol on January 6th was led by people who call themselves the alt-right. That included groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers who helped organize the events. Those groups were highly anti-Semitic, and they highly represent the excesses of the far right. Now, what they want to do is they want to pull down democracy because in their mind, it's promoting a white genocide, what they call the replacement theory. On the left, the excesses are represented by the demonstrations that we saw on college campuses over October 7th, or what we saw with the 50 days in the Portland riots. They're driven by a more radically left group who buys into postmodernism or post-structuralism or post-colonialism. Call it what you want, wokeism. This group also likes to separate people based on race, as you can see or hear from them when they talk about things like white privilege. They disregard the founding of our nation in 1776 based upon the words, that all men are created equal with what they called the 1619 projects. It disregards the ideas of Martin Luther King that we should be judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin. What is fascinating is that both the left and the right do not see people as individuals. They instead place them into a group. They both identify you by what color your skin is or by what gender you are. Now, for fun, I'm going to make a recommendation to both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on how to win independence. And, as I hope I've shown you here, if you win independence, you win this election. Let's start by talking about what some of you may know as the sister soldier moment in the Clinton campaign. This actually came from a speech given by Sister Soldier in 1992 during the Los Angeles riots. It was in response to asking a question if black on white violence was really wise. Rap star Sister Soldier said, "Yeah, I think it's wise. I mean, if black people kill black people every day, why not have a week and just kill white people?" Bill Clinton was running for president, and he went to an event sponsored by Jesse Jackson. He responded both to that quotation and to something that Sister Soldier had said in a music video of a song called The Final Solution, which was ominous in its own effect. But it says, "If there are any good white people, I haven't met them." Clinton said the following: "If you took those words white and black and you reversed them, you'd think that you were talking to David Duke giving a speech." Now, what you can see in this next slide was Jesse Jackson's reaction. His response was he was incredulous. Regardless, Clinton bowed his back to him. And many people, they credit that moment as the period when undecided voters flipped from Bush Sr. to Bill Clinton. The reason is they believed that he was willing to bow his back to his own extremes. So let's try to apply that standard to the presidential race today. First, while most experts think that Trump has the advantage, I actually believe that Kamala has the advantage. You know, a long time ago, James Carville gave me advice that I should have listened to, but without going into that campaign. His advice was that the only thing that a challenger has is the desire for change. When that desire is satiated, when change takes place, the challenger's advantage is gone. You know, there was a tremendous amount of energy for the need to change with Joe Biden. It seemed to be more with his age than his policies, but regardless, with him stepping down, change has happened. It's clear that that has significantly altered the race. However, this is still a fact. As I said in the beginning, in 7 states, less than 400,000 people, mostly independent voters, will make this decision, maybe less. If Kamala loses those voters, she will lose this election. Now, my guess is Donald Trump is being more tied to the excesses of his party than Kamala is being tied to her. That will not bode well for him in this election. But it's my guess that if Kamala is defined either by her campaign or the Trump campaign, that if she does not distance herself from the excesses of her party, the Trump campaign has the ability to tie her to the excesses of her own party. So let's start with what Trump might do to get those independent voters. President Trump's campaign is doing a major spend in those 7 states. The strategy seems clear: to make them terrified of Kamala on issues that they care about. His campaign is actually smart. Trump, on the other hand, does more to set back his own campaign by going off message than he does to help. This was clear in his speech at the convention. Go back if you get a chance and watch that. What you'll see is that Trump missed a huge opportunity after the attempted assassination. That assassination gave him the ability to convince voters that he had changed. I can't tell you what his campaign was thinking about when it came to his speech and the introduction. But watch the speech that is read while he's looking to the right or left as he looks into the teleprompter. It's a unity speech, and it's really damn good. But it was obvious that his ad lib completely destroyed the meaning of that content. Watch the ad lib words that he gives when he's looking straight ahead. That speech is as divisive as any speech I've ever heard him give. Anyway, the first thing that he needs to do, get on the same message that his campaign experts are laying out for him. That's not going to be enough, and here's why. A majority of independent voters, because of the role that Trump played on January 6th, are terrified that Trump has no limits nor any real concern about the Constitution and their right to vote. This is layered on as he makes comments about being a dictator for a day or pardoning the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers who orchestrated January 6th, or terrifying plan that's laid out in Project 2025. Now, if you haven't read the 900 pages, that's understandable. But if you find it online, if you want, it's pretty harrowing. There is nothing that Trump could do to get independence that would be more powerful to just simply acknowledge the role that he played in January 6th. He needs to reassure us. He needs to reassure those independents that he is a steadfast believer in democracy and free elections. And to do that, he won't be successful with at least telling us that what we saw on January 6th wasn't in our imagination. I don't believe that Trump will ever do this, but it would be a game changer for his campaign if he said what happened wasn't his intent and that he was to blame partially, and that he promises us that he will do all that he can do to ensure that it's not repeated. Trump does that, and people will be much more willing to listen to him on the issues of immigration or foreign policy or the economy. I'm not in agreement with Trump on a number of issues, certainly his foreign policy, but many Americans might be. They're just not really listening to him if they're in this independent group. Now, for Kamala to win independence, she needs to convince them that she's not going to be the tool of the radical woke left. Nothing exemplifies that more than the property damage and riot that happened in our universities after October the 7th. Here, the progressive left, they really need instruction and leadership and guidance, and that's something Kamala could provide. Some of the most oppressed people in the world are in Muslim countries. But most of their oppressors are Muslim authoritarians. Muslim women who are forced to wear burqas, or in Muslim Somalia, that has the recorded highest cases of female genital mutilation, with 98% of the girls between the ages of 5 and 11 having undergone type 3 infibulation, which is the most brutal form of a clitorectomy. They have no tolerance for gays, who are not only unwelcome, but they can be committing, just for being gay, a capital crime. And women are second-class citizens. The people supporting progressives need to get their heads around the idea that the forces that they are supporting today are as bad or worse than anything that the U.S. ever did on slavery. And more importantly, they need to understand that the radical ideas that they are supporting are driving average people who are appalled by these radical views towards more authoritarianism on the right. This week, Trump did a press conference on the economy. Kamala's doing hers next week. This is borne out by polling. Overwhelmingly, the economy is going to be the biggest issue in this campaign. Here, you can see that it's almost 3 times more powerful than the next issue of abortion. That spread is even greater with independents. In most polls, you'll see that the public trust Republicans on the economy more than Democrats. The reason for that isn't because Republican economies perform better than Democratic economies. The data is very mixed on that. The reason is that voters, and more importantly, independents, still believe that free markets and growth are the best solutions for the economy. What is clear to independents is that government regulation and government spending is more likely to cause economic problems than solve them. If Kamala decides to sell the American people on big government, more regulation solution to fixing economic issues, she'll sell her base really well, but she'll be at risk at losing independence. This is really evident in areas like housing, where people at lower income levels are hit the hardest. Renters are hit harder than homeowners because homeowners who are locked into a mortgage rate in the last 5 years did so at record low interest rates. And today, their home costs are about the same as they were 5 years ago. That's very different for renters. Renters' costs have skyrocketed during those same periods in most places in major cities in the United States. So the question is, how do you contain costs? Well, one approach is to look at rent controls. The other is to believe in supply and demand. Build more homes stabilizes home prices. Now, rent controls were the answer of San Francisco and New York. And yet, it's almost as much to rent a parking spot in those cities as actual mortgages in other cities. It just hasn't worked. But that doesn't mean that they won't try it and they won't try to sell you on it. With independents, that will backfire. Because if Kamala tries to sell them on rent controls, then Republicans and Trump will fire back how that failed in San Francisco and New York, and logic will win. More importantly, that approach will be used against the Democrat to show how they don't believe in free markets, and more importantly, how they buy into radical views of the economy. So I'm just going to take you back to how either of these two can win independence. They do. They win the election. Independent voters can see the excesses in both political parties, yet they believe in civil rights and equal rights and human rights. They believe in fairness and equality. They also believe in free markets and business and free enterprise. They look for balance. And most importantly, they look for politicians willing to bow their back to their own extremes. Independents have a much greater sense of individual agency, and they can smell bullshit a much greater distance than a partisan voter can. What's really important here is that this is now the largest group of voters in the United States, and they are now very aware of the partisan game being played by political and commercial actors. These independents have just simply lost faith in the two parties. They recognize that the only thing that they care about, the parties care about, is how to get power or how to hold on to power. Even the very best interests of the country are not the primary concern. It's just simply about power. This group is tired of leaders who try and destroy the American brand. They're tired of those leaders who are unwilling to find common ground. They believe that we need to listen to groups on both sides, but they are increasingly tired by these groups on each side as they scream at one another and berate one another about our nation. They're tired of listening to the doomers tell us about how everything is an existential threat to the United States. And we're tired of the anger, vitriol, and the silliness that's involved with these campaigns. We just want them to stop. But if you want to appeal to independents, it's just not that hard. This group is still deeply patriotic. They believe that the United States is a great cause for good. They understand that we have not been perfect, but yet monumentally we're better than any of the alternatives. As I said, they believe in civil rights and free markets, human rights and free enterprise. They believe that we are all created equal, and they want to have people judged by the content of their character. This group believes in the power of the individual. They want to judge others as individuals, and they demand that you see them as one. So, tune down the doomers, support the individual, and be optimistic about America, and bow your back to those extremes. You actually can win those independents and win this election.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.